All right, welcome in everybody. I am going to go ahead and just slowly get us started with some of the introductory remarks. I know people are still filing in, but welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I know you're coming from all over the world. My name is Chantal Warner. I'm one of the two co-directors of the Center for Educational Resources in Culture, Language, and Literacy, also known as CIRCLE, a Title VI National Language Resource Center housed in the College of Humanities at the University of Arizona. On behalf of myself and my colleagues here at CIRCLE and at the University of Arizona, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the final 2 days of the 2023 L2ML Symposium. And this is our first day live. So if you've not yet had a chance, please do take the opportunity after our talks and discussions today to view the video presentations that are housed on the conference site. We have 26 video presentations on there, and they're great. They really are. So please do have a look at those. We've worked really hard to try to create a humane virtual event that is cognizant of all the Zoom fatigue that many of us have experienced over the last couple of years. So that's why the live portions will be shorter days, basically half days today and tomorrow. But these virtual asynchronous presentations are really the backbone of the symposium. And taken as a whole, they capture the range of modalities, genres, the breadth of theoretical frameworks and concepts, and the richness of research and teaching methods represented in this burgeoning field of second language multimodal literacies. So we're grateful to all of the scholars. I see actually some of you here with us today who have been sharing their work through us and for their participation in this week-long event. So before I introduce our speaker, a little digital housekeeping. For the invited plenaries, such as the one that you're attending now, we will be using a webinar format. So that means you're not going to be able to unmute yourself or to use your camera, but we do have the chat for exchanging ideas and talking. And as I said, feel free to introduce yourself and tell us where you're coming from there. You can also use that space, the chat, to signal to our team who's here with us today if you have any technological issues or questions like that. And then we ask that you use the Q&A section for questions for our speaker so that I can track those for our discussion after the talk. We are also going to have 2 group discussions, one today and one tomorrow. And that's an opportunity for us to chat live with some of the presenters and with one another, and a space for us to follow up on some of the ideas and the questions that have been raised through the talks. And in that space, you will be able to unmute and to use your cameras. So that'll be a slightly different format. I also want to, even though this is a virtual event, I want to respectfully acknowledge that the University of Arizona, where CIRCLE is situated and where we're all working from today for the conference, is on the unceded land and territories of Indigenous peoples. And today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being settled on the lands of the O'odham and the Yaqui. And I can't possibly capture all of the places that almost 350 of you who are participating in this event come from. It's almost 60 countries we counted this morning, but I do want to acknowledge that many of them are also part of the same history. Okay, we're going to turn now to our first speaker for today, Denise Newfield. I'm very delighted to have Denise Newfield here with us to share work that she's been conducting over many, many years. So Dr. Newfield was until recently a professor in literacy and language education at the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa. And I suspect that some of this will already come in her talk today, but reading her work, I'm always struck with the emphasis that she places on collaboration as a means of exploring what she describes as the transformative potential of multimodal literacies. And it really just shines through, I think. She's widely published and has spoken around the world on literacy and learning, multimodality, transformative curricular and pedagogical practices. She's also the founder of ZAP, the South African Poetry Project, which brings together poets, scholars, teachers, and students in joint multimodal poetry endeavors. And there is actually a presentation in the asynchronous presentations from some of her colleagues, so I encourage you to also check that out and learn more about it. She has a wonderful article about this project in the 2020 special issue of Education as Change, which she also co-edited. She's also recently written about decoloniality in as poetry, including an article on the use of WhatsApp in and as a decolonizing tool. And I know we have many participants in this conference who are interested in computer-assisted language learning and technology-enhanced language learning, and I think that'll be a great interest to many of you. And she recently co-edited a special volume of the journal Qualitative Inquiry on Doing Academia Differently, which included a beautiful piece that she co-authored with a whole team of collaborators And she is, I believe, still co-editing a special volume of Scholarship of Teaching and Learning in the South on post-human and new materialist perspectives. And I went ahead last night and added some of these articles to our community board. So if you want to go check those out later on after the events today, you can do some reading. Her talk for us today, Poetry, Performance, and Making and Second Language Learning, is going to give us just a taste of this really rich body of work. But please join me in welcoming Denise Newfield.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much, Chantel, for that warm and perhaps not entirely deserved introduction, but I'm very grateful. Thank you. And good morning to you all, colleagues, teachers, students, delegates, English speakers, and speakers of other languages from all over the world. Goeiedag, dumela, salbona, bonjour, buenos dias. I'm happy to be with you, though I wish I could see you and meet you and be together with you at the University of Arizona. I'm deeply honored to have been invited to give this talk, and I thank the Circle Organizing Committee, especially Chantel Warner and Kate McKay, for their unstinting care, and also Yvonne Bourgeois for her superb technical help, without whom I wouldn't be here today. I'm born and bred in South Africa, a country at the southern tip of the African continent where I live and work, and which is the setting for my talk. I've been involved in poetry's role in education for a lifetime. My talk is thus located in the past, but it's also located in the present, a difficult time across the globe, but one in which classrooms should be safe, affirmative spaces for all students and teachers. On my journey, I've been accompanied by many talented educators and students whose input, inspiration, and collaboration I deeply appreciate. Amongst those present, in a sense, in my talk today are my multimodality mentor and friend, Gunter Kress, my late research partner, Pippa Stein, Soweto English teacher, Robert Ndanduleni Mangetso, Raphael Dabdon, poet, teacher, and co-researcher, and Deirdre Byrne from ZAP. I wish to dedicate this talk to them and to the students I have encountered along my journey. Okay, so as you see, my talk is called Poetry, Performance, and Making in Second Language Classrooms. At the center is the role of poetry in second language learning. Why poetry, you may ask? Has poetry not lost its currency, as critic Terry Eagleton says? Is poetry not old-fashioned, remote, and a problem in classrooms, as Richard Andrews in the UK says? In South Africa's additional language classrooms, poetry seems to have become a defunct genre, which is hardly taught. However, if narrow, restricted conceptions of poetry are challenged, poetry has great potential in second language learning as a collective meaning-making practice. I hope to show that the teaching and learning of poetry can be exciting and emancipatory for teachers and learners, and that it can contribute to literacy development. So I think I'd better give some background on literacy, language, and poetry in South African second language classrooms. It's now nearly 30 years since the advent of democracy in South Africa. State education is, however, unfortunately, still in crisis, in spite of the state's efforts to transform the previous unequal and discriminatory system. The great divide between schools which are functioning well and those which are in trouble remains. The trouble has been ascribed to a toxic mix of past and present reasons, which include poor infrastructure and weak governance, inadequate teacher training, and apartheid legacies, such as unequal resources for different racial groups. As for literacy, South African literacy levels are well below the international level. Recent results of PEARLS, the Progress in International Reading Literacy Study, are extremely worrying. They show that the majority of South African children have not mastered the basics of decoding in grades 1 and 2. They also show that almost 80% of South African grade 4 learners cannot read for meaning in any language. A bit more history seems necessary. According to current estimates, South Africa is a country of between 60 and 70 million people of diverse origins, cultures, and religions. Its history is notorious for the racially segregationist system of apartheid, and the racialized inequality endures. Apartheid is an Afrikaans word, a language derived from Dutch, meaning apartness or a state of separateness. Every sector of society was segregated by law, and in education, white children were privileged and black children received a gutter education. Only English and Afrikaans, the two colonial languages, were recognized as official. However, since the demise of apartheid in 1994, 11 languages have been recognized as official. The 11 languages are, in the order listed in the South African Constitution of 1996, Sepedi, Sesotho, Setswana, Siswati, Tshivenda, Xitsonga, Afrikaans, English, isiNdebele, isiXhosa, and isiZulu. This recognition is to redress past linguistic injustice and to promote racial reconciliation. Now, what about current language policy? For primary schools, they offer instruction in the school's dominant language from grades 1 to 4, and then shift to the language chosen by the school's governing body. English, seen as the language of power and access, is generally chosen as medium of instruction, although any official language may in fact be chosen. This fifth language. English is also taught as an examinable subject called English Additional Language. In the subject of English Additional Language, literature is a component. At the senior level, texts including poems are prescribed for study by the Department of National Education. Although some strides are being made, the list of prescribed poems remains partly British and colonial, with Shakespeare and Wordsworth sonnets as central. If poems by local authors are included, they are generally outdated or bland. Although the lists contain well-loved poems which have stood the test of time, they lack originality and do not appeal to young people. No poems by young or popular contemporary poets feature. The pedagogy and forms of assessment have been based on a watered-down version of Prac-Crit, a type of formal analysis based on close reading. The text is seen as an enclosed entity whose lines need to be translated for students and figures of speech explained. Students are just turned off. So the South African additional language context may be said to display a morbid set of symptoms, to use Antonio Gramsci's apt phrase about the difficulties of transitioning from one political system to another. Many second language classrooms had and still have grave challenges. My talk today provides 3 examples of work in which I've been involved from the past and the present, looking towards better futures. The examples are local, but I think they are built on principles that are pertinent elsewhere. I think they are pertinent to all second language learners, whether they be individual speakers of an unusual language in diverse classrooms or monocultural groups of second language speakers. My first example is low tech. The digital divide remains strong in South Africa, across schools and homes, as in much of the South, as opposed to the North. For example, I'm on the board of a literacy project called Penduka in Johannesburg. We teach grade 6s and 7s, none of whom have laptops or smartphones, either at home or at school. My example concerns poetry, but not poetry as prac-crit, as an academic exercise. Rather, it concerns poetry in relation to performance and making, the terms of my title. It is a case study of a grade 10 English classroom, a second language English classroom in the township of Soweto. In the class were 55 disaffected secondary school students who did not see the value of schooling and who played truant. Why should we come to school, they said, when the educated are unemployed and walking the streets, and the criminals cruise around in posh cars? A devastating statement, sadly retaining some relevance in 2023. However, the case study shows how teacher and students transcended the challenges of their context. Robert Ndanduleni Mangetso was their English teacher. And here he is in his classroom with students. This is Soweto 2002. It was during the first decade of South Africa's liberation, regarded by many as its honeymoon period, a time of promise and of hope. But Robert was at the end of his tether. His students wouldn't answer in more than monosyllables and wouldn't write more than a sentence or 2 in English. Most of them found English intimidating, or worse, as a kind of whip. They resisted it as a former colonial language. They refused to read their set novel. Most didn't even have a copy of the book. Out of desperation, Robert decided to try poetry with his class, even though poetry had been dropped at the school 7 years before as being too difficult for teachers and students. Although apprehensive, Robert would take a multimodal approach to poetry and see where it led. If it worked, he would carry on. If not, he'd scrap it. He began by reading a few poems and asking his students to respond in whatever form they wished. Next, they had a discussion about poetry itself. Many of them said that the concept poetry in English couldn't be translated because it didn't exist in their languages. Poetry didn't exist in their cultures. When he heard this, Robert said, no, praise poems are a traditional poetic form in South Africa, which is still practiced. What about the praise poems that are recited in your communities at births, weddings, and funerals? What about your family praises? So he set up a project for students to research their family praise poems if they didn't already know them off by heart. They should then ask parents or elders in the community, write down the poem, and then bring it to class and perform it in the vernacular. Performing the family praise poems, each in their own mother tongue, proved to be a special occasion for students to share identities and languages. One student said it was the first time he had ever dared speak in his minority language at school. My next slide is a different view of the tabua cloth. The tabua cloth is a large multimodal wall hanging of about 3 by 2.2 meters in size, so quite a large wall, made up of smaller panels which have been stitched together. The cloth was made by the students in the weeks following the performance of the praises. They made it for their teacher's visit to Beijing. He was presenting a conference paper about his difficulties in teaching literature to his second language English students. The cloth was made as a kind of collective identity object, to use Jim Cummins's term, which they sent as their ambassador, they said. As you see, tabua, the name of the cloth, is painted onto its central panel. The students made the name up from words for to speak in 3 of their languages. Teta from isiXhosa, Bula Bula from Xitsonga, and Bua from Sepedi. They said that they chose this name because it showed that they moved from silence to speech. Each individual panel, excuse me, has a hand-embroidered map, some of which are colored in. These maps show the changed internal configuration of the new South Africa. Next to each map is a family praise poem in the students' own language. Students had painstakingly inked their praise poems onto the fabric, and often that was very difficult because they were completely washed out bits of cloth or old maize bags. Here is a slide of Sandile Mtsenge's praise poem. The praise poem is in Sandile's home language of isiXhosa. Like most family praise poems, it's esoteric and not easily understood by people outside the family or clan. This poem speaks of the foul smell of a goat and also of a nearby river, Umkomanzi, which cannot be navigated by any mortal being, but only by birds flying in the sky. And here is a slide of the central panel, made of a fabric which references the shirts worn by our first president, Nelson Mandela. I don't know if any of you can remember seeing him in these shirts on TV. Around its perimeter are recycled envelopes containing poems in English, the first ones ever written by the students. I'd like to read one by Philippine Sithole, a poem about his mother. Of course, it won't have the full effect when read by me with my Lani English accent, instead of with Philippine's township pronunciation, his special vocal inflection, and his bodily rhythm, which I can't quite get. It's called The Best Mother Under the Sun. Let me put it up on the screen for you. She is a mystery, like rain under water. She can turn my life upside down, make fish to fly and birds to swim, reptiles to walk and mammals to crawl, turn predators into vegetarians and scavengers to be hunters. She is a queen in rags, a sea without water, an angel without wings, a princess without a pony. To be with her, it's like heaven to touch, angels to count, and blue skies to taste. She is the queen, powerful like a scream, 1 in a million, just like my favorite ice cream. So that was Philippine's, the first poem that he ever wrote in English. Many of the students lived in single-parent households and wrote about their mothers. I'm going to read another in a quite different tone. It's a poem we decided not to publish, so I present it anonymously. Your mother, she is blessed with 8 children by different fathers. How is she gonna feed and clothe those kids when herself she don't have a good relationship with her family and her love life? When all men just make her pregnant and hit the road and look for the cheese girls? How is she gonna listen to your needs and wants when she herself has not yet completed her missions and visions? Tell me, how is she gonna have time to listen to you when every night you want to sleep with a hot plate and wake up and go on your way to school with your stomach full? Tell me, how your mother gonna wipe your eyes when her eyes are running tears? Feet are getting so big, she says. Oh, kids, I'm really tired. Tell me, how your mother gonna cope with your stress when her legs are full of wounds? The cloth led to a year-long project with a class of students in Australia, exchanging letters, poems, and artwork. It also led to an interactive poetry slot. Students insisted on a 10-minute slot at the start of every English lesson. Then they would come to class, they said. They would go to the front of the class and perform their self-composed poems to their engaged audience of classmates who clicked their fingers or said "aish" in admiration or disdain. Here is Thembekula. On the left, he's performing his poem, The Humble Soweto. And on the right, he's reading a new poem, which he hasn't finished yet, on another occasion. In these cases and others, the student audience was enraptured. They enjoyed listening to the sound of one another's enfleshed voices. These voices were made of flesh and blood. They did not conform to the idealized Anglo-normative voice of the first language speaker. The students were at ease in poetic form. It was free from the constrictions of grammatically correct sentences, and instead was open to the playful spirit of metaphor and colloquial speech. They found the possibilities of poetry exciting and began to produce poems in their hundreds. I'd now like to read Thando Chabalala's translingual poem, Soweto for Young Freaks, an irreverent poem which refuses the victimhood and suffering of previous township poems by established South African poets of the 70s and 80s. In Soweto, there are no birds to sing in the sky. They ate them all up. In Soweto, there are no cocks to wake you up because we had them for Thanksgiving. In Soweto, there are no longer horses to ride because Basotho bajile. But in Soweto, we have AK-47 to sing. In Soweto, we have screams to wake you up. In Soweto, we have stolen cars to ride because Amajita ashaisile. I'm proudly South African and young. In Soweto, we live like the fast and furious, or else you'll be the slow and moorious. In Soweto, we eat fast foods because if you don't eat fast food, you become food. Zilambile lezindo langaphandle. Soweto, Soweto, always fast and eating, and always teaching survival skills. It's a jungle out there. Survival Soweto. So, eventually, Robert and Ndanduleni and I published an anthology of their poems, the first by South African township students. It was reprinted at least 5 times, I can't remember. Some of the poems were republished in school textbooks, for which the authors earned a fee. And here is the back cover of the anthology. The blurb, as you can see, emphasizes their journey from silence to speech. It says, from struggling with English in all its forms, they began to use poetry as a means of representing their lives. They have captured their environment in fresh, unique, and authentic ways. So what did the project do? It brought self-esteem and a new capacity for aspiration to the students. They also began to appreciate the English language as a powerful potential resource. A later poem by Philippine, who wrote The Best Mother Under the Sun, he called Paper and I. It's a poem that was written in pre-computer days, and it portrays Philippine's newly formed relationship with literacy as writing. It is a complex, intimate relationship, now difficult, now rewarding. As in the famous poem, The Thought Box by Ted Hughes, a blank page lies before Philippine before he begins to write. He says it impersonates a dead body in a mortuary. However, he sends pulses down to his fingertips, and then his pen starts to dance to his tune. But this dance is intensely demanding. It requires an artist's precision and care. The task of choosing words and letters is both physical and spiritual and difficult. Philippine says, I carve each alphabetical soul in its position. I think that's a magnificent line. It's really one of my favorite lines in all poetry. Then there are a few more stanzas, and then the poem ends on a jaunty, confident note. That's how Paper and I talked, it says. And then, as in the Ted Hughes poem, the poem is written. I shall conclude this poetry case study with a reference to measurable achievement. The end-of-year results of these formerly resistant, apathetic, failing English second language students improved dramatically, with over 95% of students passing English. And one student, Nokwanda Ntsonso, won a national scholarship the following year. Okay, I think that I should say a few words about the ideas that have informed my work and that of my colleagues. Ideas from different fields have informed our work, notably multimodality, multilingual pedagogy, and oral studies. Multimodality, as you know, sees literacy as the making of meaning in all modes, spoken, written, visual, gestural, bodily, sonic, spatial, and so on. But importantly, in multimodality, at least the Kressian version, meaning makers do not use a system, but rather they make meaning out of available resources, and they do so in transformative ways. And literacy is always situated culturally, socially, historically, politically, and semiotically. The notion of second language learners as situated makers and transformers has been fruitfully applied in South African research for a period of over 20 years. At its core lies a commitment to equity and empowerment, specifically in relation to historically disadvantaged students. The goal has been to move teachers and learners out of repression and passivity into free and peaceful spaces that facilitate agency, a tolerance of difference, and the development of creativity. Pippa Stein's work exemplifies some of the lessons of the Tabua example. Her study, called How Do I Smile in Writing, in her wonderful book of 2008, analyzes a learner's skill in oral storytelling. Lungile is a shy 13-year-old Zulu-speaking girl. Her oral performance in English draws on African storytelling practices. Her body, smile, use of hips and torso, her specific click sounds, her eye movements, all work together to animate the meanings. However, the shift from Lungile's oral story to her written one leads, in Pippa's view, to a profound loss. Pippa concludes that literacy pedagogy should value different forms of textuality, and she recommends the introduction of classroom tasks which allow students to draw on their cultural resources and semiotic talents. This recommendation is central to multilingual pedagogies as well. Nowadays, these consider the linguistic repertoires of bi or multilingual students as single integrated entities, not as different discrete languages. Translanguaging pedagogy, for example, encourages the use of full linguistic and semiotic repertoires in order to deepen learning. And I've just had a PhD student submit her thesis on using a translanguaging pedagogy in the teaching of Shakespeare to second language learners. Now to oral studies. The celebrated anthropologist Ruth Finnegan believes that oral poetry is intrinsic to the human cultural mosaic. But what do oral studies mean for the way we conceptualize poetry in second language classrooms? How does working with their central principles enable a more inclusive and informed view? For oral studies, which may be seen as a branch of African cultural studies, for example, the focus is on poetry's role in community life. Poetry is seen as a social practice rather than an art form or a text for classrooms. And it is a practice rooted in performance. Poetry has been performed in community rituals and public spaces throughout South Africa's history, in pre-colonial and colonial eras, and during the apartheid struggle. Nelson Mandela, in his book, Long Walk to Freedom, recalls a visit to his school by the great Xhosa poet Nkai. And he says, "He was like a comet streaking across the sky. I was galvanized." At the present time, oral poetry popularly takes the form of spoken word. A vibrant local poetry scene exists outside of school, where young people socialize and perform both mother tongue and additional language speakers. They take part in spoken word collectives, festivals, slams, and open mic sessions. In South African spoken word, traditional oral forms, including protest poetry of the anti-apartheid struggle, are remixed with global styles such as rap, hip hop, and jazz, and ideas from radical Black studies. Spoken word is burgeoning in South Africa, aided by the affordances of technology. Oral performers now have a space on digital platforms which teachers and students can access. Our spoken word has a wide range of themes and purposes: social critique, self-expression, and healing, as in Malika Ndlovu and Vangi Ganchel's work. These are important for South African second language learners in the light of ongoing inequalities and traumas such as gender and child abuse, food insecurity, disease, and migration. I have tried to show in this section of my talk how forging a framework out of ideas in multimodality, multilingual pedagogies, and oral studies can help teachers and educators. It can help to bridge a number of gaps. Gaps between their languages, gaps between poetry practices in and out of school, and gaps between what counts as a poet in school and in community spaces. The framework creates an expanded view of poetry, of what counts as poetry. Teachers can explore the world of poetry outside the school, including that of spoken word. They can now look beyond textbooks, and the literary canon for classroom material. In South Africa, this would mean bringing powerful current poets into the curriculum, and perhaps even into the classroom, live. Poets like Philippa Yada Villiers, Khafela Mokhogodi, Kosi Chaba, Malikan Ndlovu, Lebo Mashile, and Lesego Rampolakeng are just a few. The next section of my talk provides an example of exactly this, bringing a poem by a powerful and popular South African spoken word poet into a second language classroom. So my second example is about the study of a spoken word poem. Raphael Dabdon and I wrote about this in our article, Reconceptualizing Poetry as a Multimodal Genre, in the TESOL Quarterly of 2015. We argued that poetry should speak a language that resonates with the everyday experiences of students. And we illustrated this through the poem I Expect More From You by Vangi Ganchel. Vangi is a popular figure in the underground South African poetry scene, but she's virtually unknown in high culture and educational circles. Here she is. I would now like us to watch a video of one of Vangi's performances of this poem, with a view to exploring how this could be used in classrooms. Her poem is about South Africa's struggle. It expresses the sentiment of a generation who feel let down. They feel that sacrifices have been forgotten. The poem was published in a literary magazine in 2013, and thus it exists in print. It's also been performed many times, and some performances have been recorded and are available on YouTube. So the first question for educators is, which version of the poem should be used? Print, video, or both? Let's watch the video together. It's 5 minutes long, so we'll just watch half. I just want to say before we start that I've got to apologize for the poor visual quality. The sound is okay, so please try to concentrate on the words. In transferring it from one format to another, it became very jumpy, so I'm sorry about that.
I expect more from you, because my father fought for you. He gave himself to you instead of spending time with us. He lay on cement floors, behind bars, under beds in wardrobes, behind dustbins. He forced my mother up and down from prisons to hospitals to prisons, baby on back, searching for him because of you. For you, my mother nursed, sold, went to a battle when he couldn't work for us because he worked for you. So I expect more from you, because my uncle left home post-matric for you. He left his for you. His parents worried for you. My mother was raided, covered up, worked thrice as hard for you. So I expect more from you. Because guys lay on London benches for you. My aunt got kicked out of school, left home hidden in buckies, was locked up in dark cells, counting imaginary stars for you. She lost her love and buried her child in an unnamed grave for you. So I expect more from you. More than you, who doesn't even remember her face. Even when you abandoned her across the oceans, she served you. Even when you tried to kill her, she gave herself to you in green and black, fist high, proud for you. So I expect more from you.
Okay. So this performance took place at a club in downtown Johannesburg. Although I wasn't there on that occasion, I've experienced a few other live performances of this poem by Vangi. They are powerful and intense. The impact is, of course, somewhat diluted on video, but I think it's nonetheless instructive to discuss the nature of the performance. Questions might concern how the words and emotion are reinforced by her carefully designed delivery. How does Vangi deliver her message? How do hand gesture, facial expression, gaze, vocal tone, and volume contribute to the meaning? Where does she roll up her sleeves and shift her gaze? And how does her mode of dress, with its traditional skirt and beads and contemporary t-shirt, set up her persona on stage? A discussion of these details surely leads into the poem's intriguing and complex core questions. Who is the I in the poem, and who is the you? Here are the first few lines of the poem. And finally, perhaps, a question to everyone, to you, about whether the poem resonates with anything in your own life, or your history, or your country's history. I end my discussion by mentioning a key pedagogic factor in teaching poems like these, that of identification and modeling. As teacher scholars, Raphael and I have found that ESL students tend to identify with a poet of the same cultural background who is also not a native English speaker. Vangi Gancho's first language is isiXhosa. The students enjoy emulating the poet's style of clothing, speech, and body language, and are inclined to memorize and recite their work. This assists in enhancing competence in the target language and in recognizing poetry as an expressive art form for second language speakers. Both this example of teaching an existing spoken word poem and the previous one where the students composed and performed their own poems illustrate what a multimodal, translingual oral studies approach to poetry can do in second language classrooms. But they are particular instances. Can the approach be applied more broadly and in other contexts? My third example is about an organization which explores precisely that. Can it? And if so, how? So Chantel has already referred to ZAP, the South African Poetry Project. And I'll just speak very briefly about this because my colleagues have another slot about it. It was established in 2013 in partnership with Georgie Harrell from Cambridge University, UK. It's an activist project operating in the field of education. ZAP consists of a diverse group of academics, teachers, and poets across a range of professional locations, ages, genders, and cultures. And for all of us, it provides a space for working together outside of and across institutions, and also a space of belonging for like-minded people. ZAP upscales the ideas presented in this talk. It explores their feasibility across a range of institutions and with different groups, and examines how they can be taken further. ZAP teams operate both in school and out of school, and in different communities. I'm excited that a ZAP group is part of this symposium. Deirdre Byrne, Gerard Genis, Eunice Piri, and Zanya Liebenberg. They've uploaded their paper called Trains, Toys, and Toothpicks. It's about encouraging poetic creativity in second language learners. I know that they will be online at 10:30 today for further discussion of the ZAP project and of their presentation, and we would welcome your responses and views. Here is a picture taken at an end-of-year ZAP party a couple of years ago. With me in the pic are two students from a poetry club at a local school and one of our celebrated local poets, Makosasana Saba. So to conclude, and I've only got a minute or two left in case you are getting worried, Chantel. To conclude, I return to the questions with which I began. Why poetry? And why poetry in second language learning? What can be drawn from these examples? One thing relates to poetry as a practice useful to and potentially loved by many second language learners. The usefulness of poetry lies in its capaciousness, meaning that poetry is an open, commodious, inviting form, welcoming of language experimentation, playfulness, deviance, and accepting even of what may be regarded as error. Poetry is also open and welcoming in relation to experience, personal, social, and imagined. At the same time, it is inherently precise and concrete, requiring linguistic and performative self-reflexivity. Poetry can thus bring exciting possibilities into second language teaching and learning as a balance or counter to more formal standard approaches. Most important of all, perhaps, is that poetry, in conjunction with performance and making, can open up new ways of imagining the world of the second language classroom and of being in it. Thank you. And I thank you for your attention. I really appreciate this opportunity of sharing these experiences with you. They have a special place in my heart, and I hope that they relate generatively to your own teaching contexts. Your topics and talks are fascinating, and I intend to watch them tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk, Denise. One of the unfortunate things about the Zoom format is you can't hear everyone applaud. So you just have to imagine it in your head, because I can tell from the discussion that's what's happening. I know that people are just starting to post questions, but there's one already that came up, and then I have one that I'm hoping I might get to sneak in. And so somebody was noting that the poem that you shared, Your Mother, She Is Wounded, was viscerally profound and honest, and was asking about why it didn't get published. And so maybe just talking a little bit about these poems that you've collected along the way, that process of collecting and what was published and what wasn't.
Yeah. So I suppose we didn't publish it for ethical reasons. This excerpt that I read was part of a six-page poem about this young man's family. And although he submitted it for publication, when we thought that this would be in the public domain, outside of the safe space of the classroom, with his name on it, because they all wanted their names to be there. They did not want anything to be anonymized. We thought very hard about it, and we thought in the light of the content and what he's saying, it could be very hurtful to his mother and to himself and to his family. So that is why we didn't publish it.
Yeah, I think that I'm really glad that somebody raised that question, because I think it connects with something in some ways that I wanted to ask, because I think you beautifully demonstrated how the poetry is, as you described it, enfleshed, and that you have these flesh and blood speaking subjects and poets. But I can imagine that poses a lot of challenges in terms of data collection, and just how do you capture these incredibly rich moments of making around the poems? And I think you showed us some of the ways that you've done that, but could you talk a little bit about that aspect of your work?
I mean, that's a really great question. And I think it poses a lot of challenges for researchers. But what I want to say is that this project did not set out as a research project. It started as a pedagogic project where I was working with the teacher, and we were trying to find a solution to a very real problem that he had. He was about to give up teaching. And so we didn't really think about collecting data, videoing the students in the classroom, watching how they made the cloth. I mean, I can just picture in my head how they laid out the individual panels on the floor of the classroom and decided which one should go where and who should stitch it. So we haven't got any of that. I mean, in the end, we did ask the students to fill out questionnaires. You know, what did you think of this project? And do you think that you should have got a mark for this project? And that was really interesting, because some said, definitely, because it was the best thing I ever did. And others said, no, because there's no number that can indicate how good it was. So we have a little bit of data from those questionnaires, but we did not video what was going on in class. Now, had we from the start thought that this would be a research project as well, what would we have done? I still feel myself, but maybe that's because I'm old-fashioned myself, I still feel that when you bring cameras, video recorders, and other things into the classroom, it changes something in the relationality of what's going on. So I would be in two minds about whether to do it or not. But on the other hand, what don't I have? I don't have any of those students performing their own poems on video. I've only got still photos. Actually, at an end of term dramatic performance that they requested putting on, it was 1.5 hours long, I did record with my phone some of the performances, but they came out so badly that, you know, it's just useless. So that is a very real question that I think each teacher and each researcher has to make a decision for themselves, depending on the particularities of that group and how used they are to that sort of thing, and to what extent the researcher wants to be behind a camera rather than experiencing fully what is happening live.
Yeah, that's really helpful because there's the practical aspects that you pointed to, and then the ethical dimensions of that, and then that reality of what is the position, how the positionality of yourself as the researcher changes, that camera becomes not a neutral object. It becomes itself something material that changes the relationship. I think that's incredibly helpful. That connects to another, well, what you said about the students and their mixed opinions about whether or not they should be graded for that connects to something else, because I think something you've really demonstrated so beautifully in your talk is this persistence of poetry. There's kind of the classic view that students don't like poetry, or poetry is hard, which is at odds with this reality that it's been quite a human persisting mode of expression in a lot of ways, but one that also really, I think, resists these standardizing tables or descriptors or can-do statements in a lot of ways. And maybe that's part of why it gets left out of some aspects of second language teaching and learning. Could you talk a little bit about that? I mean, I don't want to frame it as an assessment question exactly, but that is part of what I'm asking.
Well, if I'm understanding you correctly, Chantel, I think it's an issue of, are poems going to be used as comprehension tests? Here is a little gem. Everyone in the world thinks that it's wonderful. Poetry used to be thought of as the highest form of literature, but we'll choose one where the language is fairly appropriate to you. And then we're going to check whether you understand it, and also whether you can see how it's being crafted. So what figures of speech are there? What is the structure of the poem? So it becomes an analytical academic exercise, which we kind of feel it has its place to some extent, as I think I showed in the analysis of the Vangi Gancho performance. But for second language learners, poetry has much greater potential, in my view, as something that they can use as an expressive tool to express how they're feeling about language. Maybe they're feeling alienated in a new school or in a new language. Maybe they want to pay tribute to something. If they can see that poetry can be an expressive tool that in a way has fewer rules and fewer constrictions than normal, standard, I'm saying normal, but of course it's not really normal standard academic prose of the kind that we want our learners to come out of school with. I mean, we do want them to be able to write correct English. So that is one form that they need, but I absolutely do not believe that that is the sole purpose of teaching English as a second language or even first language. And my own experience and my own projects and research projects have shown that if you get the meaning making of poetry first, that self-expressivity of it, the language almost happens by itself. Because in the case of Robert Ndanduleni's classroom, this whole project, well, it didn't end at the end of the year, but it began in about May. We went to Beijing and Robert took the cloth in July. Then they had a 3-week school holiday period. Then they came back in August, and they had August, September, October, November, another 4 months of schooling. And at the end of that year, 139 out of 141 students passed English, which was extraordinary and exceptional. So it showed that once their disposition towards the target language had changed through this vehicle of poetry, things happened. They acquired the language. I mean, it must have been latent in their brain to some extent, but they acquired the facility of producing language.
Yeah, you're getting at exactly what I was asking. The comprehension aspect, and then you mentioned the analysis and it being an academic exercise, and then I was thinking the newest companion volume to the European Common Framework does have a section now on not poetry but literature that includes it's not fresh in my head, but effectively ability to enjoy texts. But none of that quite gets at what you're describing, this expressive potential of poetry. Is that something we can assess?
Aha.
Or should we?
What is assessment? Is it summative assessment, that you're going to grade somebody so that they can pass or fail into the next grade? Or are you assessing in order to assist each individual student to move towards his or her potential, or a more advanced phase of self-reflection or communication or expression or whatever it is? So I certainly grant that the traditional form of assessment, of grading to pass or fail according to a standard, seems at odds with doing this kind of work. But, you know, as some of the students said, they wanted to get credit for this fantastic stuff that they had done across a whole range of different literacies.
It strikes me, one of the implications, I think, of what you're saying is that the poetry not only changes the student's disposition to the language, but also it pushes the teachers to change their disposition to language. And that's, I think, part of your answer about assessment.
Very much so. And, you know, on that point, I must say that Robert Ndanduleni himself, when he wrote about his own experience, he said, I began, he constructed it as a kind of train journey. Trains are used a lot in South Africa. So he said, I began at the station of desperation. I went through a stage of exploration, and I ended up at a stage of agency. So both in relation to the curriculum and pedagogy, and in relation to his own feelings about himself, this project changed him.
Yeah, that's really, I think, quite powerful, especially at this particular moment for many teachers. I have a question that's kind of takes us in a slightly different direction that relates to things that have come up on the platform. There are a lot of people interested in digital mediatedness and technology and language learning. And that was there in your talk, but it was kind of almost a subtext. But I was intrigued by one of your points that there's almost a tendency to think sometimes, I think, to think of oral practice as pre-literate, right? I mean, there's been a long tradition of critiquing that as well, but I think it still persists in some ways. But you were sort of setting up that digital mediatedness almost creates new opportunities for us to contextualize and therefore access oral practices. Could you talk a little bit about that aspect of your work?
Well, I have to say that as far as the digital is concerned, I am not a digital native. I'm on the wrong side of the age divide. And so I actually find the whole digital world of e-learning quite foreign. Also, I must be honest, and I retired before COVID hit. So unlike many of my colleagues who had to quickly become completely adept at that, I missed that opportunity. So all I can say is that I do think there is a huge space, and it should be kept, for face-to-face learning, particularly in relation to poetry performance, because the aspect of the audience and of the kind of energies, the sort of almost pre-conscious energies and intensities that pass in this relational space between poet and audience and different members of the audience cannot be recreated online. However, there is so much available online. Lessons for second language teaching, performed poets that could be brought into the classroom, that I definitely think that in, the future is in, I suppose, what is called blended learning, and should be a combination of both, as long as you have the devices. But I don't think that researchers all over the world can take for granted that their learners have access to these devices. And even if they do, there are many countries in the world, for example, South Africa, where the purchase of data is prohibitive. It is so expensive that even if someone manages to get a cell phone, they can't afford to buy data. So it's an issue that teachers and researchers in the South have to take very seriously. It certainly applies to rural aspects, rural areas, but not only rural ones, because as I said, this literacy project of which I'm on the board, none of the schools from which the children come, nor the project itself, have had any access to tablets or other devices.
I think that's an important reminder. And I think the question of the energies, maybe we'll put that out there for, I know some of the colleagues we have already tuned in right now work on virtual exchange. So maybe that's something they can pick up. For now, because we only have 1 minute left, I'm just going to be very grateful to Digital Mediatedness for allowing us to bring you from South Africa to all around the world today for this really wonderful talk. So I'm going to have to clap on behalf of everybody, but we will have the recording of this to share out. And thank you again so much, Denise, for spending this time with us and sharing your work.
And thank you to all of you at the University of Arizona and all of you delegates who have been here. And I look forward to hearing what you people have to say. Thank you.
Thank you.